The sound of horses, hooves pounding across the dusty trail, was the only warning Katherine Campbell had before her in-laws burst through the front door of her small homestead, their faces twisted with rage and their eyes glinting with malice in the soft glow of the oil lamps. "Nevada Territory, 1873, where's the money, Katherine?" Thomas Blackwell, her late husband's older brother, demanded as he stormed into the humble cabin she'd called home for the past 3 years. His wife Mary followed close behind, her thin lips pressed together in a tight, disapproving line. Katherine backed away, her heart pounding against her ribs. "There is no money, Thomas. I've told you 100 times. William didn't leave anything behind except debts and this small plot of land." "Liar," Mary spat, her face contorted with hatred. "William wrote us about the gold claim before he died, said it would set us all up for life. Now he's gone and suddenly there's nothing. We weren't born yesterday, girl." Katherine shook her head, feeling the familiar ache in her chest at the mention of her husband. William had died 6 months ago from pneumonia, leaving her alone to face his family's greed. William was delirious with fever those last weeks. He spoke of many things that weren't real. There never was any gold claim. Thomas's face darkened. He was a large man, nearly a foot taller than Katherine's petite frame, with broad shoulders and hands like dinner plates. Those hands had spent years breaking horses and lately, Katherine suspected, breaking laws. "We've been patient, Katherine, too patient. William's been dead half a year and we've let you play your little game long enough. Please, Thomas, Mary, I have nothing to give you." Katherine's voice trembled despite her effort to remain strong. At 23, she'd already endured more loss than most people twice her age. First her parents to typhoid when she was 17, then William at 28 after barely 3 years of marriage. Mary stepped forward, her bony finger jabbing at Katherine's chest. "You think you can fool us? A pretty little thing like you, batting those eyelashes and acting so innocent." William was always weak when it came to a pretty face, but we know better. Before Katherine could respond, Thomas's hand shot out, gripping her arm with bruising force. "We're done talking. Show us where the map is, now." "There is no map," Katherine cried, trying to pull away. The first blow caught her by surprise, Thomas's open palm connecting with her cheek with enough force to send her stumbling back against the wooden table. The pain blossomed hot and sharp across her face. "Thomas," Mary exclaimed, but not in protest. Her voice held excitement, a dark anticipation. "Last chance," Thomas growled, advancing on Katherine as she clutched the edge of the table. "Where's the map to the gold claim?" "I don't have it," Katherine whispered, tasting blood where her teeth had cut the inside of her cheek. "William never had a gold claim. He was a farmer, not a prospector." The second blow knocked her to the floor. The third made her ears ring. By the fourth, Katherine had curled into a ball, arms protecting her head as Thomas's boots connected with her ribs. "Stop," she gasped. "Please stop." But they didn't stop. Not until they'd torn apart every inch of her small cabin, appending furniture, slashing open her mattress, prying up floorboards in search of treasure that didn't exist. Not until Katherine lay battered and bleeding on the floor, consciousness flickering like a candle flame in the wind. "You're pathetic," Mary hissed, kneeling beside Katherine's broken form. "William deserved better than you. If you won't tell us where the gold is, we'll find it ourselves, and when we do, we'll be back to finish what we started." As they mounted their horses and galloped away, Katherine dragged herself to the overturned water barrel, desperate to clean the blood from her face. Everything hurt. Her face, her ribs, her soul. She had to get away before they returned. Thomas's parting words still echoed in her ears. "We'll be back tomorrow with shovels. This place will be dug up inch by inch until we find what's ours." With trembling hands, she packed a small bundle, the few items the Blackwells hadn't destroyed. A dress, her mother's silver hairbrush, the photograph of William on their wedding day. The pain in her side suggested broken ribs, making each movement agony, but fear drove her forward. She couldn't stay. She wouldn't survive another visit from the Blackwells. Katherine stumbled outside into the cool night air, stars twinkling innocently overhead as if the world hadn't just shattered around her. The nearest town was Pahrump, 15 miles away. She'd never make it on foot, especially not in her condition. Their only horse had been sold months ago to pay William's doctor bills. Taking one last look at the homestead she and William had built together, Katherine began walking, each step sending jolts of pain through her body. The desert stretched before her, vast and unforgiving in the moonlight. She had no plan beyond putting distance between herself and the Blackwells. By dawn, she'd made it perhaps 3 miles, her pace slowing with each passing hour. The sun rose mercilessly, promising another scorching Nevada day. Katherine's lips were cracked, her throat parched. The small canteen she'd brought was already half empty. "Just keep moving," she whispered to herself, though her body screamed for rest, one foot in front of the other. But even determination had its limits. As the sun climbed higher, Katherine's vision began to swim. The desert floor seemed to rise up to meet her, and she crumpled to the ground, the packed bundle falling from her grasp. Her last thought before darkness claimed her was of William and how she might soon be joining him. Jake Cooper pulled his hat lower against the relentless midday sun, scanning the horizon with sharp blue eyes. He'd been driving 20 head of cattle from his small ranch outside Pahrump to the trading post for the better part of 2 days. The cattle were restless, sensing water nearby, though there was none visible on the dusty trail. At 30 years old, Jake had spent most of his life in the saddle. Orphaned at 12, he'd worked ranch jobs across the territory before saving enough to buy his own modest spread 3 years ago. Life was solitary but straightforward, just how he preferred it. The war had left him with little taste for complications, human or otherwise. "Easy, Rusty," he murmured to his chestnut gelding as the horse nickered nervously, ears pricked forward. Jake followed the animal's gaze, noticing a dark shape on the ground perhaps 50 yards ahead, probably just a bundle of tumbleweeds or a discarded saddle blanket. Still, Rusty was rarely wrong when something caught his attention. "Let's check it out, boy." He clicked his tongue, urging the horse forward while signaling the small cattle dog at his heels to keep the herd together. As they drew closer, Jake felt his stomach tighten. Not tumbleweeds, a person. A woman by the look of the skirts splayed across the cracked earth. Whoa. He pulled Rusty to a stop and dismounted in one fluid motion, crossing the remaining distance on foot. The woman lay face down, one arm outstretched toward a small bundle of belongings. She was slight, with honey-brown hair falling in tangled waves around her shoulders. Jake knelt beside her, gently rolling her onto her back. What he saw made his jaw clench. Her face was a map of bruises, one eye swollen shut, dried blood crusting at the corner of her split lip, angry red marks darkening to purple across her cheekbone. "Madam," he touched her shoulder lightly. "Can you hear me?" She didn't respond, but a shallow rise and fall of her chest confirmed she was alive. Jake grabbed his canteen, trickling a small amount of water between her parched lips. Some instinct made him glance over his shoulder, scanning the empty landscape. Whoever had done this might still be nearby. The woman moaned softly, her unswollen eye fluttering open to reveal a startling green iris, clouded with pain and confusion. "Easy now," Jake said, his voice low and calming, the same tone he used with frightened horses. "You're safe." "I'm going to help you." She tried to speak but managed only a dry croak. Jake offered more water, which she accepted gratefully. "Blackwells," she whispered after a moment, her voice raw. "They'll come back." "No one's coming right now except me," Jake assured her, though he slid his hand to the revolver at his hip instinctively. "What's your name, madam?" "Katherine," she managed. "Katherine Campbell. I'm Jake Cooper. I've got a ranch about 10 miles from here." He studied her injuries with growing anger. Someone had worked her over thoroughly and recently. "Who did this to you, Mrs. Campbell?" "My husband's family," she whispered, tears leaking from the corners of her eyes. They think William left gold. There isn't any gold." Jake nodded, not pressing for more details. The woman Katherine needed medical attention, not an interrogation. "I'm going to get you to town. Dr. Milligan's a good man," fear flashed in her visible eye. "No, not Pahrump. They'll look for me there first." Jake considered this, mentally calculating. His ranch was closer than the next town over. "All right, I'll take you to my place, get you patched up, then figure out what's next." Relief softened her battered features. "Thank you." As gently as possible, Jake gathered Katherine into his arms. She was lighter than he expected, and he could feel her bones beneath his fingers. She whimpered when his hand pressed against her ribs. "Sorry," he murmured, adjusting his hold. "Broken ribs?" "I think so," she confirmed, her breath hitching. Jake carried her to Rusty, considering how best to situate her for the ride. "I'm going to put you up in the saddle. I'll walk alongside and lead the horse. It'll be less jarring for those ribs." Katherine nodded weakly. Jake lifted her into the saddle as carefully as if he were handling fine china, steadying her when she swayed dangerously. Her small bundle of belongings he tied to the saddle horn. "Just hold on to the pommel." "Rusty's gentle as they come," Jake assured her, taking the reins and clicking to his cattle dog. "Bandit, bring him along." The loyal dog circled the small herd, keeping them in line as Jake led horse and rider across the parched terrain. Katherine remained silent except for occasional sharp intakes of breath when Rusty's movements jostled her injuries. Jake found himself glancing up at her frequently, noting the straight line of her back despite her pain, the determined set of her jaw. Whatever else Katherine Campbell might be, she wasn't weak. "How far did you walk before you collapsed?" he asked after they'd been traveling for nearly an hour. "From our homestead," she replied, her voice stronger now that she'd had more water. "Maybe 3 or 4 miles northeast of here." Jake nodded, impressed despite himself. With injuries like hers, most men would have struggled to make half that distance. "We'll reach my place before sundown. It's not much, but there's clean water and a bed." "That's more than I could hope for," Katherine said softly. "Why are you helping me, Mr. Cooper?" Jake kept his eyes on the trail ahead. "Out here, you help someone in trouble or you're no better than the coyotes. Some might say it's not wise to get involved in another man's business." "The man who did this to you," Jake said evenly, "forfeited any claim to business when he laid hands on a woman." Katherine fell silent after that, and Jake didn't push for conversation. The sun beat down mercilessly, and he kept a careful pace, mindful of both Katherine's injuries and his cattle. Bandit worked tirelessly, darting back and forth to keep the small herd together. By late afternoon, the simple structures of Jake's ranch came into view: a modest cabin with a covered porch, a sturdy barn, and corrals for livestock. It wasn't much compared to some of the grander spreads in the territory, but Jake felt a quiet pride in what he'd built with his own hands. "There it is," he said, nodding toward the buildings. "Home." Katherine followed his gaze, and something in her expression, a mixture of relief and wistfulness, tugged at Jake's conscience. This woman had lost everything by the looks of it. "It's lovely," she said sincerely. Jake helped her down from Rusty when they reached the yard, once again lifting her into his arms when her legs threatened to buckle. He carried her into the cabin and gently deposited her on his bed, the only proper one in the house. "I need to get the cattle settled," he explained. "There's water in that pitcher. I'll be back soon to tend those cuts." Katherine nodded, already sinking into the relatively soft mattress. "Thank you, Mr. Cooper." Jake tipped his hat and stepped outside, whistling for Bandit to help corral the cattle. As he worked, his thoughts kept returning to the battered woman in his cabin. Who exactly were these Blackwells, and what kind of men beat a defenseless widow? More importantly, would they come looking for her? Jake wasn't a man who sought trouble, but he wasn't one to back down from it either. If the Blackwells showed up at his door, they'd find more than they bargained for. By the time he finished with the livestock and returned to the cabin, the sun was setting, painting the desert in shades of amber and gold. Jake knocked lightly on his own door before entering, not wanting to startle Katherine. He found her sitting up in bed, her face freshly washed, though the bruises stood out even more starkly against her pale skin in the fading light. "I've got some salve that might help with those bruises," Jake offered, moving to the small shelf where he kept medical supplies. Living alone on a ranch meant being prepared for injuries, and bandages for those ribs. "I can manage," Katherine began, but Jake shook his head. "No offense intended, Mrs. Campbell, but you can barely move without wincing. Let me help." After a moment's hesitation, Katherine nodded. Jake gathered his supplies and pulled a chair beside the bed. With surprisingly gentle hands for a man who worked cattle, he applied salve to the worst of her facial injuries. "This will sting," he warned before dabbing at the cut on her lip. Katherine didn't flinch. Up close, Jake noticed flecks of gold in her green eyes and the delicate curve of her jawline beneath the bruising. She was younger than he'd initially thought, probably mid-20s at most. For the ribs, I'll need to. Jake cleared his throat, suddenly uncomfortable. Understanding dawned in Catherine's eyes, followed by a blush that colored her unbruised cheek. Perhaps just show me how to wrap them and I can manage. Jake nodded, relieved. Of course, I'll step out while you prepare. Just call when you're ready for instructions. He waited on the porch, watching as the first stars appeared in the deepening blue sky. After a few minutes, Katherine called softly, and he re-entered to find her sitting with a blanket draped over her shoulders, her dress loosened but still preserving her modesty. With clinical efficiency, Jake demonstrated how to wrap the bandages tightly around her ribs, then handed her the roll. Not too tight or you'll have trouble breathing, but firm enough to support the bones while they heal. Katherine nodded, taking the bandages. Could you? Would you mind turning around? Jake obliged, facing the wall until Katherine informed him she was finished. When he turned back, she was once again properly covered, though he couldn't help noticing the color in her cheeks. Thank you, she said softly, for everything. Jake moved to the small stove, stoking the fire and setting a pot of beans to warm. You must be hungry. It's not fancy, but it's filling. Anything would be wonderful, Katherine assured him. I haven't eaten since yesterday morning. As Jake prepared a simple meal of beans, cornbread, and coffee, Katherine told him about the Blackwells, how they'd appeared at her door the previous night, convinced her late husband had hidden a map to a gold claim. How they'd torn apart her home searching for it, then beaten her when she couldn't produce something that never existed. William was a dreamer, she explained, her voice softening at the mention of her husband. Always talking about the fortune we'd make someday, but it was just talk. We scratched out a living from that small farm, nothing more. Jake set a plate before her. Eat while it's hot. You need your strength. Katherine accepted the food gratefully, though she ate slowly, mindful of her split lip. Jake sat across from her at the small table, his own plate untouched as he considered her story. These Blackwells, he said finally. They from around here? Katherine shook her head. California, Sacramento, I think. They came east after William died, convinced he'd struck it rich before his passing. And they're likely still searching your property, Jake concluded, which means they may not be looking for you yet, but they will be when they realize you've gone. Fear flickered across Katherine's face. I didn't think that far ahead, I just knew I had to get away. You did right, Jake assured her, but we need to consider what comes next. They sound like the type to hold a grudge, especially if they think you've denied them what they believe is theirs. Katherine set down her fork, appetite apparently gone. I have nowhere to go, Mr. Cooper. No family, no friends close enough to help. William and I kept to ourselves mostly. Jake studied her across the table, noting the quiet dignity she maintained despite her circumstances. Many women would have collapsed into hysterics after what she'd endured. Katherine Campbell was made of sterner stuff. You can stay here until you heal, he found himself saying. I've got a spare room, it's small, just a cot really, but it's yours if you want it. I'll take the barn. Katherine's eyes widened. I couldn't possibly impose. It's not an imposition, Jake interrupted. It's the decent thing to do. People will talk, she protested weakly. A widow staying unchaperoned with a bachelor. Jake's mouth quirked up at one corner. Mrs. Campbell, my nearest neighbor, is 5 miles away, and he's a half-blind prospector who talks more to his mule than to people. I don't think we need to worry about gossip. A small smile touched Katherine's lips, transforming her face despite the bruises. Then I accept your offer, Mr. Cooper. But only until I'm well enough to make other arrangements. Jake nodded, finally starting on his own meal. That seems fair. As night fully descended outside, Jake made up the small cot in the spare room with fresh linens, then gathered what he needed to sleep in the barn. Katherine watched from the doorway, leaning against the frame for support. I'm putting you out of your own home, she said, guilt evident in her voice. I've slept in worse places, Jake assured her. During the war, any patch of dry ground was a luxury. Katherine's gaze sharpened with interest. You fought, Jake nodded, not elaborating. Those weren't memories he cared to revisit. Get some rest, Mrs. Campbell. Morning comes early on a ranch. Katherine, she said softly. Please call me Katherine. Jake met her gaze, something unspoken passing between them. Good night then, Catherine. Good night, Jake. As he made his way to the barn, bedroll tucked under his arm, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that his orderly, solitary life had just been irrevocably altered. Whether that was for better or worse remained to be seen. Catherine woke to sunlight streaming through unfamiliar windows and the distant sound of hammering. For a moment, disorientation gripped her, followed swiftly by the sharp reminder of her situation, as pain radiated through her body when she attempted to sit up. The events of the previous day came rushing back: the Blackwell's attack, her desperate flight, collapsing in the desert, and finally, Jake Cooper finding her and bringing her to his ranch. She touched her face gingerly, wincing at the tenderness of her bruises. Moving carefully to account for her injured ribs, Catherine rose and made her way to the small washstand in the corner. The face that looked back at her from the mirror was barely recognizable. Her left eye was still swollen, though she could now open it a sliver. Purple and yellow bruises mottled her cheek and jaw, and her lip was crusted with dried blood. "Oh, William," she whispered, "how did it come to this?" After washing as best she could with her limited mobility, Catherine changed into her spare dress, the only one she'd managed to bring in her hasty flight. It was wrinkled from being bundled up, but clean at least. She smoothed it down as best she could, then ventured out of the small bedroom. The main room of Jake's cabin was simple but tidy. A table with 4 chairs stood near the cooking area, a rocking chair beside the stone fireplace, and a bookshelf filled with well-worn volumes occupied one wall. It spoke of a man who lived simply but valued comfort. The hammering continued outside. Catherine followed the sound to the front porch, where she found Jake working on what appeared to be a new chair, his powerful arms driving nails with practiced efficiency. Bandit lay nearby, thumping his tail in greeting when he spotted her. Jake looked up, pausing mid-swing. "You're up. How are you feeling?" "Like I've been trampled by cattle," Catherine admitted with a wry smile that pulled at her split lip. "But alive, thanks to you." Jake set down his hammer, hungry. "There's coffee on the stove and biscuits keeping warm in the oven." "You've already been up for hours, haven't you?" Catherine realized, noting the amount of work he'd already accomplished. The sun wasn't even fully above the mountains yet. "Ranch work doesn't wait," Jake said simply, wiping his hands on a rag. "Come on, let's get some food in you. You're already too thin." Catherine followed him inside, surprised by his observation. William had never noticed such things. Jake pulled out a chair for her, then served up biscuits, bacon, and eggs with the efficiency of a man accustomed to fending for himself. "This is wonderful," Catherine said after her first bite. "I didn't expect a bachelor to be such a good cook." "Necessity," Jake replied with a shrug. "It was either learn or eat burnt beans for the rest of my life." They ate in companionable silence for a few minutes before Jake spoke again. "I've been thinking about your situation." Catherine set down her fork, suddenly tense. "Yes. Those Blackwells will likely come looking for you once they realize you've gone. Pahrumph's the nearest town. They'll start there, asking questions." "I know," Catherine said quietly. "I've put you in danger by coming here." Jake waved away her concern. "I can handle myself. But we should consider what story to tell if anyone comes asking. The truth isn't always the safest option." "What do you suggest?" Jake considered for a moment. "You could be my cousin, come to help out after hearing I was on my own. Most folks around here don't know much about my family, so they wouldn't question it." Catherine nodded slowly. "That could work, until I'm well enough to move on at least." Something flickered in Jake's eyes at her mention of leaving, but it was gone so quickly Catherine thought she might have imagined it. "In the meantime," he continued, "you should rest. Those ribs won't heal if you're up and about too soon." "I can't just sit idle while you work," Catherine protested. "There must be something I can do to earn my keep." Jake studied her for a moment, his blue eyes thoughtful. "Can you sew?" Catherine nodded. "Very well, actually, my mother taught me." "Then there's a pile of shirts and socks that could use mending. Been putting it off for months." He stood and retrieved a basket from a shelf, setting it beside her chair. "Nothing urgent, mind you, only if you're feeling up to it." Catherine appreciated his attempt to give her purpose without making her feel like a burden. "Thank you. I'd like to be useful." After breakfast, Jake returned to his chores outside while Katherine settled in the rocking chair by the window with the mending basket. The simple, repetitive motion of needle and thread was soothing, giving her time to think while still accomplishing something tangible. Her thoughts circled back to the Blackwells. Would they really come looking for her? Thomas had always been obsessive, even when William was alive. His conviction that William had discovered gold seemed unshakable, despite all evidence to the contrary. And then there was Jake Cooper. Catherine's needle paused as she contemplated her rescuer. He was unlike any man she'd met before, quiet but not cold, strong but gentle. He'd opened his home to a stranger without hesitation, asking nothing in return. William had been kind too in his way, but there was something different about Jake. A steadiness, perhaps. William had been full of grand dreams and schemes, always chasing the next opportunity. Jake seemed content with what he had built, focused on the present rather than some imagined future. Katherine resumed her sewing, realizing she was comparing a man she'd known for less than a day to her husband of 3 years. The thought made her uncomfortable, as if she were somehow being disloyal to William's memory. Yet as the morning passed into afternoon, Katherine found her gaze repeatedly drawn to the window, watching Jake as he worked in the yard. There was something compelling about his quiet competence, the way he moved with purpose and precision. Once he looked up and caught her watching. Instead of turning away embarrassed, Katherine smiled slightly, and Jake nodded in acknowledgement before returning to his task. By evening, Katherine had mended most of the items in the basket. Her ribs ached from sitting upright for so long, but there was satisfaction in accomplishing something useful. When Jake came in from the barn, smelling of horses and hay, she had soup simmering on the stove, a simple potato and bacon soup made from what she'd found in his pantry. "You didn't have to cook," Jake said, hanging his hat on a peg by the door. "It was no trouble," Katherine replied. "Besides, I wanted to thank you somehow." Jake washed up at the basin, then joined her at the table. After saying grace, they ate in comfortable silence until Katherine worked up the courage to ask what had been on her mind all day. "How long have you lived here alone?" she inquired. Jake looked up from his bowl. 3 years, bought the place after working cattle drives for most of my 20s. "No family," a shadow crossed his face. "Parents died when I was young, raised mostly by my grandfather until he passed too, then it was just me." "I'm sorry," Katherine said softly. "I know how that feels. I lost my parents to typhoid when I was 17. William was like a lifeline, then the first person who made me feel I wasn't completely alone in the world." Jake nodded in understanding. "How long were you married?" 3 years, not nearly long enough." Katherine stared into her soup. He was a good man. Always full of dreams, always certain the next big opportunity was just around the corner. But honest, he would never have stolen or cheated to get ahead, no matter what his brother thinks. "Some men can't understand that kind of integrity," Jake observed. "They assume everyone's as crooked as they are." "Exactly." Katherine looked up, surprised by his insight. "Thomas always thought William was hiding something, even when we could barely afford seed for the next planting." Jake refilled her water glass. "And you, what dreams did you have?" The question caught Katherine off guard. No one had asked about her dreams in a very long time. "I wanted a family," she admitted. "Children, a home filled with laughter and love, simple things, I suppose." "Not simple at all," Jake disagreed. "Those are the things that matter most." Their eyes met across the table, and Katherine felt a strange flutter in her chest that had nothing to do with her injuries. She looked away first, suddenly conscious of how intimate their conversation had become. "I should change your bandages," Jake said after a moment, clearing his throat. "If you're comfortable with that." Katherine nodded, grateful for the change in subject. "Thank you." As Jake carefully helped her rebind her ribs, his hands were as gentle as they had been the day before. Katherine found herself thinking that William, for all his good qualities, had never shown such care in handling her. William had loved with grand gestures and passionate declarations. Jake's kindness was quieter, expressed through actions rather than words. That night, as she lay in the small cot listening to the desert sounds filtering through the window, Katherine felt more conflicted than she cared to admit. Grief for William still occupied a large space in her heart, but she couldn't deny the comfort she found in Jake's presence or the way her pulse quickened when their eyes met. "It's just gratitude," she whispered to herself in the darkness. "Nothing more." But even as she closed her eyes, Katherine knew she was lying to herself. Days passed, settling into a routine that felt surprisingly comfortable. Each morning, Katherine woke to find Jake already working outside. She would prepare breakfast, they would eat together, and then Jake would return to his ranch duties while Katherine took on more household tasks as her strength returned. Her bruises began to fade from purple to yellow, and though her ribs still ached, she could move with greater ease. She found herself looking forward to evenings when Jake would return from working his land, and they would share supper and conversation by lamplight. On the fifth day, Jake entered the cabin around noon, an unusual break in his routine. "I need to ride into Pahrump for supplies," he announced. "We're running low on flour and coffee, and I should check if there's been any word about the Blackwells." Katherine looked up from the shirt she was mending, anxiety tightening her chest. "Do you think they're looking for me?" "Better to know than not know," Jake replied pragmatically. "I'll be careful not to raise suspicions, just casual inquiries while I'm buying supplies." "I wish I could go with you," Katherine said wistfully, "but with these bruises—" "Too recognizable," Jake agreed. "Better you stay here for now." He hesitated, then added, "Will you be all right alone?" "I should be back by nightfall." Katherine smiled at his concern. "I'll be fine. Bandit will keep me company, won't you, boy?" The cattle dog, who had taken to sleeping at Katherine's feet in the evenings, thumped his tail in response. Jake nodded, seemingly satisfied. "Keep the shotgun close, just in case. It's loaded on the rack by the door." After Jake had ridden out, Katherine found the silence of the cabin oppressive. She'd grown accustomed to knowing he was nearby, even when they weren't in the same space. To distract herself, she decided to bake bread a small way to repay Jake's hospitality. As she kneaded the dough, Katherine reflected on how much her life had changed in less than a week. The constant fear that had been her companion since William's death had receded, replaced by a tentative sense of security. Jake's home had become a sanctuary, and Jake himself, Katherine's hands stilled in the dough. What exactly was Jake becoming to her? More than a rescuer, certainly, a friend. Yes, but something else lurked beneath that friendship. Something that made her heart race when their hands accidentally touched, or when she caught him looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. "Stop it," she muttered to herself, resuming her kneading with more force than necessary. "You're a widow of 6 months, and he's only helping out of kindness." But even as she shaped the dough into loaves and set them to rise, Katherine couldn't quite convince herself that what she felt for Jake Cooper was merely friendship or gratitude. There was something more, something that both frightened and exhilarated her. The bread was just coming out of the oven, filling the cabin with its homey aroma, when Katherine heard hoofbeats approaching. Relieved that Jake had returned safely, she wiped her hands on her apron and moved toward the window. The smile froze on her face. It wasn't Jake's chestnut gelding approaching, but 2 unfamiliar horses carrying riders she recognized instantly. Thomas and Mary Blackwell. Katherine's blood turned to ice in her veins. How had they found her? She ducked away from the window, heart hammering painfully against her injured ribs. They must have followed Jake from town, guessing he knew something about her whereabouts. There was no time to run, they were already in the yard. Katherine grabbed the shotgun from the rack, her hands trembling so badly she nearly dropped it. She'd never fired a gun in her life, but they didn't need to know that. The knock, when it came, was deceptively polite. "Hello, anyone home?" Thomas's voice called. Katherine remained silent, praying they would think the cabin empty and leave, but Mary's sharp voice cut through that hope. "We know you're in there, Katherine. We followed your cowboy friend from town. He was asking mighty specific questions about us." "Just want to talk, Katie girl," Thomas added, his tone falsely conciliatory. "No hard feelings about our misunderstanding." Katherine backed away from the door, shotgun clutched to her chest. The doorknob rattled as Thomas tested it, finding it locked. "Come on now, don't be difficult," he cajoled. "William would want us to sort this out like family." "Go away," Katherine finally called, her voice stronger than she felt. "There's nothing to discuss." A heavy silence followed, then the sound of boots on the porch steps moving away. For a moment, Katherine thought they might actually leave. Then came the crash of breaking glass as something was hurled through the window. "We can do this easy or hard," Thomas shouted from outside. "But we're not leaving without what's ours." Katherine raised the shotgun, aiming it at the window as Thomas's face appeared in the broken pane. When he saw the weapon, his eyes widened momentarily before his face twisted into a sneer. "You don't have the spine to use that," he taunted. "William always said you were soft." "William never said any such thing," Katherine replied, struggling to keep her voice steady. "He loved me." "Something you wouldn't understand." Thomas's expression darkened. "Last chance, Katherine. Tell us where the map is or we're coming in, and this time we won't stop until you tell us what we want to know." Katherine's finger trembled on the trigger. "There is no map, there never was." With a roar of frustration, Thomas smashed more of the window with the butt of his pistol, creating an opening large enough to climb through. Katherine closed her eyes and pulled the trigger. The blast was deafening in the small cabin. The shotgun's recoil sent Katherine staggering back, pain lancing through her injured ribs. When she opened her eyes, Thomas was gone from the window and she heard cursing from the yard. "You crazy bitch," Mary's voice shrieked. "You could have killed him." Katherine moved cautiously to the broken window, keeping the shotgun raised. Thomas was on the ground, clutching his shoulder while Mary hovered over him. The blast had caught him in the upper arm, not a mortal wound, but enough to draw blood. "Next time I won't miss," Katherine warned, surprising herself with her own courage. "Leave now or I'll aim better." Thomas glared up at her, his face contorted with pain and rage. "This isn't over," he spat. "It is for today," came a new voice, cold and hard as steel. Jake sat atop Rusty at the edge of the yard, rifle leveled at Thomas's head. Bandit stood beside the horse, hackles raised and teeth bared. Relief washed over Katherine like a wave. "Jake, you all right?" he called, not taking his eyes off the Blackwells. "Yes," Katherine answered, though her ribs screamed in protest from the shotgun's recoil. Jake nudged Rusty forward, stopping a few yards from where Thomas still sat clutching his bleeding arm. "You're trespassing on my property and threatening my family," he said, his voice dangerously calm. "I suggest you leave while you still can." Mary helped Thomas to his feet, her thin face pinched with hatred. "Your family, she's William's widow, not your kin." "My cousin," Jake corrected smoothly, the lie they'd agreed upon rolling easily from his tongue, "and under my protection." "Now mount up and ride out or I start shooting. Unlike the lady, I don't miss." Thomas wavered on his feet, blood seeping through his fingers. "This isn't the end," he growled. "For your sake, it better be," Jake replied. "Because if I see either of you within 50 miles of here again, they'll be shipping your bodies back to California in pine boxes." The threat hung in the air, made all the more potent by the rifle in Jake's steady hands and the cold certainty in his voice. Even from where she stood, Katherine could see the calculation in Thomas's eyes, weighing his options and finding them wanting. "Come on, Mary," he finally muttered. "Help me to my horse." Jake watched impassively as Mary helped Thomas mount, an awkward process given his injured arm. Only when they had both swung into their saddles did Jake lower his rifle slightly. "One more thing," he said as they prepared to ride away. "I've spoken to Sheriff Hollister in town. He knows all about you two and your false claims. Try anything like this again and you'll be facing more than buckshot." Thomas's face contorted with rage, but he was in no position to argue. With a final venomous glare at the cabin, he wheeled his horse around and rode off, Mary following close behind. Jake watched until they disappeared from sight, then dismounted and rushed to the cabin door, which Katherine had already flung open. Without a word, she stepped into his arms, the shotgun clattering to the porch as she released it. "You're shaking," Jake murmured, his arms encircling her carefully to avoid her injured ribs. "I thought they would kill me," Katherine whispered against his shirt, "if you hadn't come when you did." "But I did," Jake said simply, one hand moving to stroke her hair, "and you did well. Most men I know wouldn't have had the courage to fire that shotgun." Katherine pulled back slightly to look up at him. "I had to protect myself, protect this." Her gesture encompassed the cabin, but Jake sensed she meant more than just the physical structure. "Come inside," he said gently. Let me check your ribs. That shotgun's got a hell of a kick. In the cabin, Jake carefully examined Catherine's bandages while she told him what had happened. His jaw tightened when she described Thomas breaking the window. I shouldn't have left you alone, he said, guilt evident in his voice. I knew they might come looking. You couldn't have known they'd follow you from town, Katherine reassured him, and I managed, thanks to your shotgun and timely return. Jake's hands stilled on her bandage. When I saw their horses in the yard, heard that shot. His voice trailed off and something in his expression made Catherine's breath catch. I thought I might be too late. You weren't, she said softly, covering his hand with her own where it rested against her side. Their eyes met, and the air between them seemed to thicken. Jake's gaze dropped to her lips, and for a moment, Katherine thought he might kiss her. The realization that she wanted him to was both shocking and exhilarating, but Jake pulled away, clearing his throat. Your ribs don't seem worse, but you should rest. I'll fix that window and keep watch tonight in case they're foolish enough to come back. Katherine nodded, trying to hide her disappointment. I baked bread, she said, for want of something else to say. Jake smiled, the tension between them easing somewhat. I noticed. Smells wonderful. That night, despite Jake's insistence that she rest, Katherine found sleep elusive. She kept reliving the moment she'd pulled the trigger, the shock of the blast, the sight of Thomas falling back with blood on his sleeve. And beneath that, the memory of Jake's arms around her, strong and reassuring. From the main room, she could hear Jake moving quietly about, checking the repaired window, stoking the fire. Keeping her safe, as he had from the moment he'd found her in the desert. Katherine pressed a hand to her heart, feeling it race beneath her palm. She was falling in love with Jake Cooper. The realization should have frightened her, coming so soon after William's death. Instead, it felt like waking from a long, troubled sleep into gentle sunlight. Whether Jake felt the same, she couldn't say. But in the quiet darkness of the Nevada night, Katherine allowed herself to hope. The attack by the Blackwells changed things between Katherine and Jake, though neither spoke of it directly. There was a new awareness in their interactions, a carefulness that hadn't existed before. Jake found reasons to stay closer to the ranch rather than ranging far afield, and Katherine often caught him watching her when he thought she wasn't looking. A week passed without sign of the Blackwells. Katherine's bruises faded further, and her ribs began to heal in earnest. She took on more tasks around the ranch, no longer content to remain inside with mending. Jake found her one morning feeding the chickens, her face tilted up to catch the early sunlight. Should you be doing that? He asked, though there was no reproach in his tone. Katherine turned, smiling at the sight of him leaning against the chicken coop. I'm feeling much better. Besides, I've never been good at sitting idle. Jake nodded, something like admiration in his eyes. Most women who have been through what you have would still be abed. I'm not most women, Katherine replied, dusting feed from her hands. No, Jake agreed quietly, you certainly are not. The moment stretched between them, full of unspoken things. Finally, Jake cleared his throat. I need to ride the north pasture today, check on a break in the fence. Would you like to come along, get some fresh air? Katherine brightened at the suggestion. After nearly 2 weeks of being confined to the immediate vicinity of the cabin, the prospect of open spaces appealed greatly. I'd love to. Are you sure I won't slow you down? We'll take it easy, Jake assured her. And Rusty's gentle enough for you to ride. I can take one of the other horses. An hour later, they set out from the ranch, Katherine astride Rusty while Jake rode a spirited black gelding he called Shadow. The day was perfect clear blue sky, a gentle breeze and the desert stretching out around them, painted in subtle shades of amber, rust, and sage. It's beautiful, Katherine said as they crested a small rise, looking out over Jake's land. So different from where I grew up in Ohio. I thought the desert would be empty, but it's full of life if you know how to look. Jake glanced at her, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Most people never bother to look. They see hardship where I see challenge, emptiness where I see possibility. Is that why you stayed after the war? Katherine asked. For the possibility, Jake was quiet for a moment, his eyes scanning the horizon. Partly, mostly I stayed because I couldn't go back. The war changed me, changed all of us who fought. The East felt crowded after that. Too many expectations, too many reminders. Katherine nodded, understanding. William had never spoken much about his time in the war, but she'd seen how it haunted him in quiet moments. William was the same. He'd wake sometimes, shouting orders to men long dead. The dreams fade, Jake said, but they never completely go away. They rode in companionable silence after that, Jake occasionally pointing out features of the landscape or signs of wildlife. Katherine found herself relaxing in the saddle, enjoying the gentle rhythm of the horse beneath her and the vast openness surrounding them. When they reached the broken section of fence, Jake dismounted to make repairs. Katherine watched him work, admiring the efficiency of his movements and the strength in his shoulders as he straightened bent posts and replaced broken wire. William would have struggled with this, she observed without thinking. He was better with books than with his hands. Jake glanced up from his work, and yet he chose to homestead. It was the dream of land that drew him west, Katherine explained. The idea of something that was truly ours, not borrowed or rented. He believed in the promise of it, even if the reality was harder than he'd imagined. Jake nodded, hammering a staple into a post to secure the wire. Nothing wrong with dreams, long as you're willing to put in the work to make them real. That was William's struggle, Katherine admitted softly. The gap between dreaming and doing. Jake straightened, wiping his brow. And you? What was your struggle? Katherine considered the question, surprised by his perceptiveness. Learning to balance his dreams with what we actually needed. William would see stars while I counted pennies. Sounds like you complemented each other, Jake observed, returning to his repair work. We did, Katherine agreed, a familiar pang of grief washing through her. Though sometimes I wished. She trailed off, uncertain whether to continue. Jake looked up, waiting. Sometimes I wished he would see me as clearly as he saw his dreams, she finally said. That he would be as passionate about our life together as he was about the future he imagined. Jake held her gaze for a long moment. A man who couldn't see what was right in front of him wasn't looking properly, he said quietly. Heat rose in Katherine's cheeks at the implied compliment. Before she could respond, Jake turned back to the fence, driving the final staple home with perhaps more force than necessary. They ate a simple lunch of biscuits and jerky beside a small spring, sheltered by one of the few trees in the area. Katherine leaned back against the trunk, enjoying the rare shade. Jake sat nearby, hat tipped back, watching a hawk circle lazily overhead. I've been thinking, he said suddenly, about what happens next. Katherine's stomach tightened. Was he preparing to ask her to leave? Her healing had progressed well. She could likely travel now without serious discomfort. The Blackwells might come back, Jake continued, or they might not. Either way, you'll need to decide what you want to do. I know I can't impose on your hospitality forever, Katherine said carefully, studying the remaining biscuit in her hand rather than looking at him. I've been considering my options. And, Jake prompted when she didn't continue. Katherine sighed, there aren't many. I could try to return to my homestead, but without William, I can't work the land alone. And the Blackwells might come back there too. I could seek employment in Pahrump, perhaps as a seamstress or housekeeper, but positions for women are limited. You could stay, Jake said, so quietly she almost didn't hear him. Katherine looked up sharply. What? Jake met her gaze steadily. You could stay at the ranch with me. As your housekeeper? Katherine asked, heart suddenly racing. As my wife, Jake clarified, his voice remarkably calm though she could see tension in the set of his shoulders. Katherine stared at him, speechless. Of all the possibilities she'd considered, this had not been among them. Jake, hear me out, he said, holding up a hand. I know it's sudden, I know you're still grieving William, but these past weeks, having you at the ranch, it's been good, better than good, and I think you feel it too. I do, Katherine admitted softly, but marriage, we barely know each other. Jake's mouth quirked up at one corner. I know you're brave, I know you're kind, I know you can make bread that would make angels weep and you sing to yourself when you think no one's listening. I know your heart's still healing, but it's strong and true. What else matters? Tears pricked at Katherine's eyes. You make it sound so simple. It can be, Jake said, if we want it to be. He reached across the space between them, taking her hand in his. I'm not asking for an answer today, just think about it. Katherine nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. Jake squeezed her hand once, then released it, standing and extending an arm to help her up. "We should head back," he said. "Storms brewing to the west." Sure enough, dark clouds were gathering on the horizon. They mounted their horses and rode for home, the impending storm and Jake's unexpected proposal hanging between them. The wind picked up as they neared the ranch, carrying the scent of rain. Fat droplets began to fall just as they reached the barn, and by the time they'd unsaddled and brushed down the horses, the storm had arrived in earnest, rain drumming on the roof overhead. "We'll have to make a run for it," Jake said, glancing at the cabin through the open barn door. The yard between had become a churning sea of mud. Katherine smiled, a sudden lightness filling her despite the storm. "I'll race you," she said impulsively, and darted out into the rain before Jake could respond. She heard his surprised laugh behind her, then the sound of his boots splashing through puddles as he gave chase. The cold rain soaked through her dress in seconds, plastering her hair to her face and neck, but Katherine didn't care. For the first time since William's death, she felt truly alive, every nerve singing with the sensation of rain on her skin and the knowledge that Jake was just behind her. She reached the porch steps a heartbeat before him, laughing as she turned to claim victory. Jake was right there, rain dripping from the brim of his hat, his blue eyes alight with something that made her breath catch. "You win," he said, his voice barely audible above the storm. "What's my prize?" Katherine asked, breathless from the run and from the way Jake was looking at her. Instead of answering, Jake closed the distance between them, one hand coming up to cup her cheek. His touch was gentle, questioning. Katherine leaned into it, giving her answer without words. When their lips met, it was like nothing Katherine had ever experienced. William's kisses had been passionate but demanding. Jake's was a request, an offering. She responded in kind, her hands finding their way to his shoulders as the kiss deepened. The rain continued to fall around them, but neither noticed. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard, and the look in Jake's eyes sent a shiver through Katherine that had nothing to do with her wet clothes. "We should go inside," Jake said, his voice rougher than usual. Katherine nodded, suddenly shy despite what had just passed between them. Jake opened the cabin door, ushering her in ahead of him. The warmth inside was a welcome contrast to the chill of the rain. "You need to get out of those wet clothes," Jake said, moving to stoke the fire. "I'll wait outside while you change." "No," Katherine said, surprising herself with her boldness. When Jake turned to look at her, she added, I've made my decision about staying." Jake went very still. And Katherine took a deep breath. "Yes, I'll stay. I'll be your wife." The smile that broke across Jake's face was like sunrise after the darkest night. He crossed the room in 2 strides, gathering her into his arms and lifting her off her feet in an exuberant embrace. "Jake," Katherine laughed, clinging to his shoulders. "My ribs." He set her down immediately, concern replacing his joy. "I'm sorry, did I hurt you?" Katherine shook her head, still laughing. "No, they're much better, but you should know what you're getting, a wife who's still a bit battered." "You're perfect," Jake said with such conviction that Katherine blushed, his expression sobered slightly. "Are you sure, Katherine? I don't want you to feel pressured or obligated because of what I've done." "I'm sure," she said softly. "I wasn't looking for love again. I thought that part of my life was over when William died, but then you found me and everything changed." She reached up to touch his face, tracing the strong line of his jaw. "You brought me home, Jake Cooper, in every way that matters." Jake turned his head to press a kiss to her palm, a gesture of tenderness that brought fresh tears to Katherine's eyes. "When can we be married?" he asked. Katherine smiled through her tears. "As soon as possible. I don't need a fancy ceremony or a new dress, just you." "Tomorrow then," Jake decided. "We'll ride into Pahrump and find the preacher. Weather permitting," he added, glancing toward the window where rain still lashed against the glass. "Tomorrow," Katherine agreed, her heart so full she thought it might burst. She had never expected to find love again, especially not so soon after losing William. Yet here it was, offered by a quiet cowboy with steady hands and a steadier heart. As Jake pulled her into another kiss, gentler this time but no less passionate, Katherine silently thanked whatever fate or providence had led him to find her that day in the desert. Out of the ashes of her old life, something new and beautiful had taken root, promising a future she had never dared to imagine. The storm raged throughout the night, but by morning it had passed, leaving the desert washed clean and glistening in the dawn light. Katherine woke early, a flutter of anticipation in her stomach at the thought of what the day would bring. She dressed in her best gown, the one she'd been wearing the day Jake found her, now cleaned and mended. It wasn't a proper wedding dress, but it would have to do. As she pinned her hair up, Katherine caught sight of her reflection in the small mirror. The bruises had faded to faint yellowish shadows, and the swelling around her eye was completely gone. She looked like herself again, or rather, a new version of herself. There was a spark in her eyes that hadn't been there before, a quiet confidence born from surviving the worst and finding unexpected joy on the other side. Jake was already up, as usual, when Katherine emerged from her room. He dressed in what she guessed were his Sunday clothes, a clean white shirt, dark trousers, and a vest she'd never seen before. His hair was neatly combed and he'd trimmed his beard. The effect was striking, and Katherine felt a rush of warmth at the thought that he'd made such an effort for her. "Good morning," he said, his eyes taking in her appearance with obvious appreciation. "You look beautiful." Katherine smoothed her hands over her skirt self-consciously. "It's not much of a wedding outfit, I'm afraid." "Doesn't matter," Jake replied. "It's the bride that makes the dress, not the other way around." His simple compliment brought color to Katherine's cheeks. "Are we still going into town today?" Jake nodded, picking up his hat from the table. "Weather's cleared. Road might be muddy, but Rusty and Shadow can handle it." "I thought we'd take the wagon, more comfortable for you." Katherine smiled at his thoughtfulness. "When should we leave?" "Soon as you're ready," Jake replied. "I've already fed the stock and hitched the team." As they drove toward Pahrump, the sun climbed higher in the sky, burning away the last traces of the storm. Jake handled the team confidently, occasionally pointing out landmarks or wildlife to Katherine. She found herself studying his profile, the strong line of his jaw, the way the corners of his eyes crinkled when he smiled. This man was to be her husband before the day was out. The thought both thrilled and terrified her. "Having second thoughts?" Jake asked, catching her staring. Katherine shook her head. "No, just marveling at how quickly life can change. A month ago I was alone and afraid. Now I'm heading to town to marry a man I barely knew 2 weeks ago." Jake's expression grew serious. "We can wait longer if you want. There's no rush." "No," Katherine said firmly. "I don't want to wait. It might seem sudden to others, but out here, life doesn't always give you the luxury of time." She reached across the seat to cover his hand with hers. "I know enough, Jake. I know you're a good man. I know I feel more alive with you than I have in a very long time. The rest we can figure out together." Jake turned his hand to clasp hers, his smile returning. "Together, I like the sound of that." Pahrump was a small settlement, little more than a wide spot in the road with a general store, a saloon, a blacksmith, and a few other essential businesses clustered together. A small white church stood at the eastern edge of town, its steeple the tallest structure for miles around. As Jake guided the wagon down the main street, Katherine became aware of curious glances from the townspeople. Most had probably heard about the Blackwells by now, and Jake's sudden appearance with a woman was bound to set tongues wagging. They stopped first at the general store, where Jake needed to pick up some supplies. As they entered, the proprietor, a barrel-chested man with mutton chop sideburns, looked up in surprise. "Cooper, wasn't expecting you back so soon." His curious gaze shifted to Katherine. "And who might this be?" "Mr. Simmons, this is Katherine Campbell," Jake said, a protective hand at the small of Katherine's back. "Soon to be Katherine Cooper if Preacher Johnson is available today." Simmons's bushy eyebrows shot up toward his receding hairline. "Is that a fact?" "Well, congratulations are in order then." He extended a meaty hand to Katherine. "Welcome to Pahrump, Mrs. Campbell, or should I say the future Mrs. Cooper." Katherine shook his hand, smiling politely. "Thank you, Mr. Simmons." "Preacher should be at the church this time of day," Simmons continued, turning back to Jake. "What can I get you today?" While Jake ordered supplies, Katherine browsed the store's modest selection of goods. She was examining a bolt of blue calico when a woman's voice spoke behind her. "You must be the widow Cooper found out in the desert." Katherine turned to find a handsome older woman watching her with shrewd eyes. "Yes, I am Katherine Campbell, Martha Hollister," the woman replied. "My husband's the sheriff. Word travels fast in a small town like this." Katherine tensed, uncertain whether the sheriff's wife approved of her presence, but Martha's next words put her at ease. "Glad to see you recovered. Those Blackwells are nasty pieces of work. Sheriff ran them out of the county last week after they caused a ruckus at the saloon. They're gone." Katherine couldn't keep the relief from her voice. Martha nodded. "Headed back to California with their tails between their legs, according to the stage driver." She glanced toward Jake, who was still occupied with Simmons. "Cooper's a good man, one of the best in these parts. Keeps to himself mostly, but always ready to lend a hand when needed." "Yes, he is," Katherine agreed softly. Martha's keen eyes didn't miss the way Katherine's expression softened when she looked at Jake. "Well now, that explains the rumors about a wedding," she said with a knowing smile. "Good for you both. Life's too short to waste time, especially out here." After completing their purchases, Jake and Katherine made their way to the small church. Preacher Johnson, a thin man with kind eyes and a perpetual smile, greeted them warmly. "Mr. Cooper. A rare pleasure to see you in town, let alone in my church." Jake shifted uncomfortably, hat in hand. "Got a special reason today, preacher. This is Katherine Campbell. We'd like to be married if you're available." The preacher's smile widened. "Is that so? Well, the Lord works in mysterious ways." "When were you thinking?" "Today, if possible," Jake replied. "Today?" The preacher looked between them, his expression curious but not judgmental. "I see. Well, I have no other obligations this afternoon, but we'll need witnesses." "I can help with that," came Martha Hollister's voice from the church doorway. She stepped inside, followed by a tall man wearing a sheriff's badge. "My husband and I would be honored to stand up for you." Katherine looked at Jake, who seemed as surprised as she was by the offer. "That's very kind of you, Mrs. Hollister," she said. "Martha, please," the older woman insisted. "And this is my husband, Sheriff Daniel Hollister." The sheriff tipped his hat. "Cooper, madam, heard what happened with the Blackwells. Glad to see it's all worked out for the best." With the witnesses secured and the preacher ready, there was nothing to delay the ceremony. Katherine found herself standing before the simple altar, Jake beside her, as Preacher Johnson opened his Bible. The ceremony was brief but meaningful. When asked for a ring, Jake produced a simple gold band that had belonged to his mother, kept safe all these years for a bride he hadn't known he was waiting for. As he slipped it onto Katherine's finger, his hands were steady, but his eyes held a vulnerability that brought tears to hers. "I now pronounce you man and wife," Preacher Johnson declared with evident satisfaction. "Mr. Cooper, you may kiss your bride." Jake's kiss was gentle yet possessive, a promise of all that was to come. When they separated, Katherine was aware of Martha Hollister dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief and the sheriff clapping Jake on the back. "Congratulations, Mrs. Cooper," Martha said, embracing Katherine. "May God bless your union with many years of happiness." The rest of the day passed in a blur. The Hollisters insisted on treating the newlyweds to a meal at the small hotel dining room where news of their marriage had already spread. Several townspeople stopped by their table to offer congratulations, curious about the woman who had captured the reserved rancher's heart. As they drove home in the late afternoon, the setting sun painting the desert in shades of gold and crimson, Katherine leaned against Jake's shoulder, content in a way she hadn't been since long before William's death. "What are you thinking?" Jake asked, his arm around her shoulders. "That I never expected to be happy again," Katherine admitted. "After William died, I thought that part of my life was over, and then when the Blackwells came." She shuddered at the memory. Jake's arm tightened around her. "You don't have to worry about them anymore. Sheriff Hollister said they left the territory." "I know, it's just strange how life works sometimes. If they hadn't attacked me, I never would have fled. You never would have found me." "I like to think I would have found you somehow," Jake said quietly. "Some things are meant to be." Katherine smiled up at him, touched by the sentiment. "When did you know that you wanted to marry me, I mean?" Jake considered the question. "I think part of me knew the moment I saw you lying in the desert, not that I was thinking about marriage then," he clarified with a small smile. "But there was something, A feeling that you were going to change my life, I just didn't know how much. And I thought you were an angel, Katherine confessed. When I first opened my eyes and saw you bending over me, the sun was behind your head like a halo. Jake chuckled. No one's ever mistaken me for an angel before. You were to me, Katherine said seriously. You saved my life, Jake, in more ways than one. Jake brought the wagon to a stop, turning to face her fully. In the fading light, his blue eyes were dark and intent. You saved mine too, Katherine. I didn't realize how empty my life was until you filled it. He kissed her then, a kiss deeper and more passionate than any they had shared before. Katherine responded eagerly, her arms winding around his neck, all thoughts of the journey home momentarily forgotten. When they finally arrived at the ranch, twilight had deepened to dusk. Jake jumped down from the wagon, then reached up to lift Katherine, carrying her across the threshold of the cabin in the traditional manner. "Welcome home, Mrs. Cooper," he said as he set her on her feet in the main room. Katherine looked around the cabin that had sheltered her for the past 2 weeks, seeing it with new eyes. No longer just a refuge, but a home. Their home. "It feels different somehow," she observed. "It is different," Jake replied, moving to light the lamps. "Everything is." As the warm glow filled the room, Katherine felt a moment of nervousness. They were husband and wife now, with all that entailed. Though they had shared kisses, there was an intimacy to come that both thrilled and frightened her. Jake seemed to sense her sudden uncertainty. "I'll take care of the horses," he said, heading for the door. "Take your time." Grateful for his sensitivity, Katherine used the time to wash and change into her nightgown, adding a robe over it for modesty. She brushed out her hair until it fell in waves down her back, then sat on the edge of the bed, their bed now waiting for Jake's return. When he entered, freshly washed from the pump outside, he paused at the sight of her. "Katherine," he said softly, and her name on his lips was like a prayer. He crossed to where she sat, kneeling before her and taking her hands in his. "We don't have to rush anything," he assured her. "I know this has all happened quickly." Katherine touched his face, tracing the strong line of his jaw with gentle fingers. "I'm not afraid, Jake, not of you." "Never of you?" His eyes darkened at her words. Slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away, Jake leaned forward to kiss her. What began as a gentle meeting of lips quickly deepened into something more urgent, more primal. Katherine found herself responding with a passion that surprised her, her hands moving into his hair as his arms encircled her waist. When Jake finally pulled back, they were both breathing hard. "Tell me if I go too fast," he murmured, his voice husky with desire. "I will," Katherine promised, though she doubted she could deny him anything in that moment. What followed was a discovery of each other, tender at first, then increasingly passionate as inhibitions fell away. Jake was attentive and gentle, mindful of her still healing ribs, yet there was a possessiveness to his touch that made Katherine feel cherished rather than constrained. For her part, Katherine surprised herself with her own boldness. With William, intimacy had been pleasant but somewhat perfunctory. With Jake, it was a revelation, each touch, each kiss building toward something she hadn't known was possible. When they finally came together as husband and wife, Katherine felt as though she was discovering a part of herself that had been dormant all her life. In Jake's arms, she found not just physical pleasure but a deep emotional connection that brought tears to her eyes. Afterward, lying in the circle of Jake's arms with her head on his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart, Katherine felt a profound sense of rightness. Whatever doubts she might have had about the swiftness of their courtship had dissolved in the certainty of what they'd just shared. "Jake," she whispered into the darkness. His hand stroked lazily through her hair. "Thank you for finding me." Jake's arms tightened around her. "Thank you for being someone worth finding." As sleep claimed them, Katherine's last thought was that out of the ashes of her old life, something miraculous had grown, a love that had found her when she least expected it but most needed it. Spring gave way to summer, and summer to fall. Katherine flourished as Jake's wife, her inner strength matching the external healing of her body. The bruises faded completely, and though she occasionally felt a twinge in her ribs during damp weather, the physical reminders of the Blackwell's attack eventually disappeared. Life on the ranch settled into a comfortable rhythm. Jake continued his work with the cattle and land, while Katherine transformed the cabin into a true home. She planted a vegetable garden, made curtains for the windows, and added small touches that softened the bachelor simplicity of the place without diminishing its functionality. They rode into Pahrump together once a month for supplies and socializing. Katherine gradually formed friendships with several of the town's women, particularly Martha Hollister, who took her under her wing. Jake, though still reserved by nature, found himself more willing to engage with the community now that he had Katherine by his side. On a crisp October morning, Katherine stood at the stove, stirring a pot of oatmeal for breakfast when a wave of nausea swept over her. She gripped the edge of the stove, taking deep breaths until the feeling passed. It was the third morning in a row this had happened. "You all right?" Jake asked from the doorway, having just come in from his early chores. Katherine turned to him with a smile she couldn't quite contain. I think I might be with child." Jake went very still, his eyes widening. "A baby," he said, as if testing the word. Katherine nodded, her hand moving instinctively to her still flat stomach. "It's too early to be certain, but all the signs are there." In 3 quick strides, Jake crossed the room and swept her into his arms, lifting her feet off the floor as he spun her in a circle of pure joy. "A baby." He repeated, his face alight with happiness. Katherine laughed, clinging to his shoulders. "Jake, put me down before I'm sick all over you." He set her down immediately, concern replacing excitement. "Sorry, are you all right? Should you be resting? Do you need the doctor?" "I'm fine," Katherine assured him, touched by his concern. "Women have been having babies since the beginning of time. I'm just a little queasy in the mornings." Jake led her to a chair anyway, kneeling before her with his hands on her knees. "A baby," he said again, softer this time, with wonder in his voice. "Our baby." Katherine covered his hands with hers. "Are you happy?" "Happy doesn't begin to cover it," Jake replied, his blue eyes suspiciously bright. "I never thought I'd have a family of my own. After the war, after all the things I'd seen and done, I figured some men just weren't meant for that kind of happiness. And now," Katherine prompted gently. Jake's smile was answer enough, but he spoke anyway. "Now I know better. Now I know that sometimes life gives you exactly what you need, even when you don't know you need it." Katherine leaned forward to kiss him, her heart so full it felt like it might burst. When they separated, Jake kept his hands on her still flat belly, a protective gesture that brought fresh tears to Katherine's eyes. "I'm going to build a cradle," he decided. "And we'll need to add another room to the cabin, and a proper fence around the yard so the little one can play safely." "And Jake," Katherine interrupted with a laugh, "we have months before the baby arrives, plenty of time for all of that." "Right," he agreed, though the calculating look in his eyes told her he was already planning improvements. "But I want everything to be perfect." "It already is," Katherine assured him, placing her hand over his where it rested on her stomach. "We're together, that's all that matters." As her pregnancy progressed, Katherine found herself enveloped in Jake's protective care. He insisted on taking over the more strenuous chores, hired a local boy to help with the ranch work so he could spend more time close to home, and began the promised expansion of the cabin with single-minded determination. By February, when the winter winds howled across the Nevada desert, the new room was complete, a nursery adjoining their bedroom, with a window positioned to catch the morning light. Jake had crafted a sturdy cradle from pine, and Katherine sewed tiny garments in the evenings as they sat by the fire, Jake reading aloud from one of his books. "Have you thought about names?" Jake asked one such evening, looking up from his reading. Katherine smiled, her hands continuing their steady work on a small gown. "I've been considering Sarah for a girl after my mother. For a boy, perhaps William." She watched Jake carefully as she spoke her late husband's name, uncertain how he would react. To her relief, he nodded thoughtfully. "William Cooper has a good sound," he agreed. "A strong name for a son." "You wouldn't mind?" Katherine asked. "Naming our child after my first husband?" Jake set his book aside, reaching for her hand. "Katherine, William was a part of your life. He brought you west, which eventually led you to me. I'd never want you to forget him or pretend that part of your life didn't exist." Tears sprang to Katherine's eyes at his generosity of spirit. "I don't deserve you, Jake Cooper." "That's where you're wrong." Jake replied, lifting her hand to his lips. You deserve far better, but I'm doing my best to be worthy of you. In early April, as the desert burst into its brief but spectacular bloom, Katherine went into labor. Jake rode like the wind to fetch Martha Hollister, who had experience assisting at births, then paced anxiously outside as the two women worked within. After hours that seemed like days to Jake, Martha emerged with a broad smile. Congratulations, Mr. Cooper, you have a son. A strong, healthy boy with a good set of lungs on him. Jake rushed past her into the bedroom where Katherine lay propped against pillows, a small bundle cradled in her arms. Her face was tired but radiant, her eyes shining with a joy that took Jake's breath away. Come meet your son, she said softly. Jake approached the bed almost reverently, sitting carefully beside Katherine to peer at the tiny face nestled against her breast. The baby had a shock of dark hair, and when he opened them briefly, eyes as blue as Jake's own. William James Cooper, Katherine said. If that suits you, it's perfect, Jake whispered, gently touching the baby's cheek with one finger. He's perfect. You're perfect. As spring turned to summer once more, the small family settled into their new normal. Baby William, called Will by his parents, thrived under their care, growing strong and curious about the world around him. Jake proved to be a natural father, as patient and gentle with his son as he was with skittish colts. Katherine often watched from the porch as Jake carried Will around the ranch, pointing out horses and chickens, clouds and stars, speaking to the infant as if he understood every word. In those moments, her heart felt so full it was almost painful. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Will sleeping peacefully in his cradle beside them, Jake took Katherine's hand in his. Are you happy? He asked, a question he still posed from time to time as if he couldn't quite believe their good fortune. Katherine turned to look at him, this man who had found her at her lowest point and carried her to safety not just physically that first day, but emotionally every day since. More than I ever thought possible, she answered truthfully. When the Blackwells attacked me, I thought my life was over. I never imagined that fleeing would lead me to the greatest happiness I've ever known. Jake brought her hand to his lips, a gesture that had become familiar but never lost its power to warm her heart. I thank God every day that I decided to take that particular trail with the cattle. That I found you when I did. As do I, Katherine agreed softly. You didn't just save my life that day, Jake, you gave me a new one. They sat in comfortable silence as the last rays of sunlight painted the desert gold. Will stirred in his cradle, making the small cooing sounds that always brought smiles to his parents' faces. Jake reached down to rock the cradle gently, his other hand still entwined with Katherine's. I love you, Mrs. Cooper, he said quietly, the simple declaration all the more powerful for its understatement. Katherine leaned her head against his shoulder, content in a way she had never imagined possible 2 years ago. And I love you, Mr. Cooper, today, tomorrow, and all the days after. As the first stars appeared in the deepening blue of the Nevada sky, Katherine reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. From the terror of the Blackwells' attack to the security of Jake's arms, from the desperation of her flight to the joy of the family they had created together. Life in the West was unpredictable, sometimes harsh, but also filled with unexpected blessings. Katherine had found her blessing in a quiet cowboy with steady hands and a steadier heart, a man who had carried her home and made her feel safe again. And in that safety, she had found not just healing, but a love deeper and truer than any she had known before. A love built on respect, kindness, and unwavering support. A love that had given her not just a second chance at happiness, but a happiness greater than she had dared to dream. As night fell fully over the desert, Katherine Cooper knew with absolute certainty that she was exactly where she was meant to be, home, with the family she and Jake had built together. Whatever challenges tomorrow might bring, they would face them side by side, their love a shelter stronger than any storm. 20 years later, the Cooper Ranch had grown considerably over the decades, expanding from Jake's original modest, spread to one of the most prosperous operations in the county. The simple cabin had been transformed into a comfortable 2-story home, Surrounded by cottonwoods Jake had planted the year Will was born, Katherine stood on the wide front porch, watching as riders approached from the east. Even at a distance, she recognized her eldest son's straight-backed posture in the saddle so like his father's it sometimes took her breath away. At 20, William James Cooper was the image of Jake at that age, with the same piercing blue eyes and quiet competence. Beside him rode his sister Sarah, 18 and fiercely independent, her honey-brown hair so like Katherine's own braided and tucked under her hat. The youngest Cooper, 12-year-old Daniel, named for Sheriff Hollister who had become like family over the years, brought up the rear on his pinto pony. "They're back," Katherine called over her shoulder, knowing Jake would be waiting for news. He appeared in the doorway, still handsome at 50 though silver now threaded his dark hair. The years had been kind to them both, lines of laughter more prominent than those of hardship on their faces. "Good timing," Jake observed. "Martha and Daniel should be here soon for supper." The Hollisters, now in their 70s but still spry, remained the Coopers' closest friends. Their monthly suppers were a tradition stretching back 2 decades. As the children, though Katherine supposed they weren't really children anymore, dismounted in the yard, she noted with a mother's keen eye that Will looked particularly pleased with himself. "How was Pahrump?" she called. "Growing by the day," Sarah replied, leading her horse to the water trough. "Mr. Simmons says the railway survey crew was through last week. If the line comes through, we'll be connected all the way to Carson City." Katherine nodded, watching as Will hung back, clearly bursting with news but trying to maintain his usual composure. "Will, everything all right?" "Better than all right," he replied, a grin finally breaking through his attempt at nonchalance. "I asked Emma Johnson to marry me. She said yes." Katherine gasped with delight, hurrying down the steps to embrace her son. Emma, the schoolteacher's daughter, had been sweet on Will for years, though he'd been too shy to acknowledge it until recently. "Congratulations," she exclaimed. "When?" "Next spring," Will replied, his cheeks coloring at his mother's enthusiasm. "After the calving season." "If that's all right with you and Pa." "More than all right," Jake said, coming to clap his son on the shoulder. "Emma's a fine young woman. You've chosen well." As the family moved inside to continue the discussion over cold lemonade, Katherine found herself overwhelmed with gratitude. Their lives had not been without challenges, droughts, harsh winters, economic downturns, but through it all, the love she and Jake shared had only deepened, providing a foundation of strength for their family. Later that evening, after the Hollisters had come and gone and the children had retired to their rooms, Katherine and Jake sat on the porch swing that had replaced the rocking chairs many years ago. The desert night was cool and clear, a canopy of stars stretching from horizon to horizon. "Another wedding to plan," Katherine mused, leaning against Jake's solid warmth. "Our first baby getting married. Seems like yesterday he was learning to walk," Jake agreed, his arm around her shoulders. "Time passes too quickly." Katherine looked up at his profile, so dear and familiar after 20 years of marriage. "Any regrets?" she asked softly. "About any of it?" Jake turned to meet her gaze, the love in his eyes as clear and unwavering as it had been the day he proposed. "Not a single one," he said with certainty. "Finding you was the best thing that ever happened to me, Katherine Cooper. Everything good in my life came from that moment." Katherine reached up to touch his face, fingers tracing the familiar contours. "I sometimes think about how different things might have been. If the Blackwells hadn't come that night, if I hadn't fled, if you hadn't been on that particular trail." "But I was," Jake said simply. "And here we are, here they were indeed, 20 years and 3 children later, still finding joy in each other's company." The frightened widow and the solitary cowboy had built something beautiful together, a life filled with love, laughter, and purpose. As Jake bent to kiss her, Katherine reflected that some journeys, though they begin in darkness and fear, lead to the brightest destinations. Her journey had led her to Jake Cooper, to safety, to love, to home, and she wouldn't change a single step along the way.